Hi, we continue in Genesis 37 today after the brothers have put Joseph in the pit and sat down to eat. And what a horrific scene it is, and what it's telling us about family and the family of Jacob, and the question of the future, where they can be cold-hearted enough to leave their brother in a pit where they certainly would expect that he would die there out in an open field with nobody else around except the one man who was wandering, who doesn't appear to be there. After all, they're in Dothan or somewhere near Dothan, and he was back in Shechem. But the fact that they are hungry, or that they decide the thing to do now, they put their brother in the pit, is to eat, is just a horrifying scene. And maybe the rest of the story of the family of Jacob here is about undoing that, or seeing what the consequences are of that, as we'll continue. And in our scene today, where we shift from the Reuben plea to the Judah plea, we're going to see a number of words that are not necessarily key words here, but are key words in the larger story that are pointing us forward to a sense of biblical karma that will come back to get them. So we'll see that as we go. On the right side of the screen, you can see some of the issues we've been looking at that I went over in detail in the opening introductory video to this unit, and I really encourage you to look at that if you haven't. So you go through some of the connections both within the story and how the pieces fit together, as we looked at last time around the question of whether there might be two sources, one for a Reuben version and one for a Judah version, which I've showed because of chiasms and other links is not required way to see the text. We can read it clearly as a unity, but also its relationship with Exodus, with the monarchy story, with Daniel, etc., and the question of where all the characters are. And in terms of the character of Jacob, we've certainly seen he's been incredibly passive, sending his beloved son Joseph out to go after the brothers who he knows hate their younger brother, his beloved son, and not seeming to be very concerned about things. And we see almost the same thing about Joseph so far, that he objects to nothing and is seemingly put in the pit without a whimper or a word. That really can't be the case, but perhaps we're hearing it from the brother's perspective. They just simply cannot hear him crying out. So let's look at a couple other things before we get in our scene to situate where we are in our story. So we've been looking through this unit here. Of course, we're on chapter 37, and I won't go over again what I've repeated a number of times here about the unity of these 5 chapters, and of 37 and 38 in particular. We'll look at one hint of that today, and we'll look more of that as we get to chapter 38. And we've also been looking at the key words in section here, so we'll see that our section ends today with the beginning of a chiasm that will take us down to the end here, although we've also been looking from Fackelman a chiasm that includes this whole section here that you can see on the screen right now. They overlap a little bit because it goes down to 33 here, and yet chiasms can do that. So as we saw in the keywords, there's been a lot of movement. Today there's not so much movement in terms of the language of movement, although there's mysterious movement from 3 different places, as we'll see. Where they're sitting down to eat, where the traders are, and where the pit is. And it's very mysterious as we go, so we'll have to look closely at that. But clearly the emphasis is on the pit, that they put their brother in the pit. As we've been looking at the doubles and triples through this section, and I actually amended this since last time because I realized that lay hands on him is twice, once out of the mouth of Reuben last time, let's not lay hands on him, and now here it comes up again, as we'll see momentarily. So that's just another one of the many doublings, and that's one of the elements by which other scholars and myself agree that the doubling in terms of a Reuben and Judah version is not a matter of sloppy editing or 2 different sources, but a matter of the intentional way the story is written to provide multiple perspectives. And one thing that's hard to note in terms of words, because it's not present specifically in words, are multiple possible motivations. So we saw at one level the brothers hate him because he's the lord of the dreams and dreaming he'd rule over them. But at another level they hate him because the fathers preferred him and given him the special long sleeve coat. So they have multiple reasons for hating them, and they have multiple reasons now for what they want to do with him. Are they trying to get rid of them, or are they trying to make a profit off him? And that's what we'll have to look at a little more closely. As we review the atlas of where we are, we're somewhere in Dothan here, and the traders are coming from this way, and Jacob is all the way down here in Hebron, last we heard, and of course Egypt's way down here. So we were told last time that they know that this caravan of traders are Ishmaelites. We don't know how. They came from Gilead. Well, they're coming from the east, but it didn't have to be Gilead. It could have been Mizpah or any of these other places. And they're going to Egypt. And again, they don't have to be going all the way down to Egypt. There's a long way, and we have no sense that the brothers are intending to go to Egypt yet. They won't for a few more chapters. So a lot of that's mysterious, and that's what we see in verse 25. But starting in verse 26, we get Judah. So as we did last time with Reuben, let's look at what we know about Judah before this, and the reality is we know nothing. Simply his birth announcement from Leah, the last of Leah's children there. And of course, we know, and the audience of Genesis certainly knows, that Judah became the name of the Jerusalem-centered polity from which the monarchy was, and David comes from the line of Judah, and we'll see links to that as we continue to look at parallels between the Jacob and Joseph stories and the David story. So certainly the character of Judah has something to do with both the lineage of David and the character of the other ethnic nationality, if you will, apart from Israel. And since Jacob is Mr. Israel and Judah is his son, there's a relationship there, of course, of father and son. But in the pictures of monarchy, they're of equal different nations. And so we'll play out that tension as we go, but not in this immediate scene. So we'll see Judah today, starting with the question that we'll see here in verse 26. And then chapter 38 is all about Judah and Tamar there, and none of the other brothers or Jacob are mentioned there. And so a lot of Judah's characters revealed there, and I'm not laying out the whole chapter here, but we'll look at it as we go. But later in the Joseph story, he has several important speeches. This is really one speech interrupted in verse 6 and 7 by Jacob's response. And so he's telling him here in the face of the demand for Benjamin, that the man, who's Joseph, of course, demands that the youngest brother come, and Jacob saying, I can't lose both of my younger sons. He warns him, we have to do this. And then he adds, we need to get on with this. You can hold me accountable. And if we had not delayed, we would have now returned twice. So Judah making the case for why it's safe to send Benjamin with him on behalf of the father, although it was we'll see it's Judah here. I've said it backwards both times. It's confusing, isn't it? Reuben, who is concerned with returning him to the father, and that's what we see in verse 29 down here. And then finally in verse 44, chapter 44, 16 to 34, and you can see how long it is, especially from a biblical perspective, the longest speech in Genesis, when Judah speaks to Joseph and not knowing he's Joseph yet, giving him a summary of the whole story from his perspective. That'll be very important when we get there. But the fact that the writer gives him 17 verses to give this speech is really something. And then finally, in the closing blessings and curses from Jacob on his sons, we hear Jacob describe Judah as a lion's whelp, which is to say, from his mother, like a lioness, perhaps. That's from Rachel, or not from Rachel, in this case from Leah, of course. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him. Something about monarchy there, perhaps, although ruler's staff is not necessarily the same as monarchy. When we get to chapter 49, we'll look at that. And as I was noting, just to anticipate what we'll be looking at when we get to chapter 38, the number of parallels between Judah in chapter 38 and Joseph in the Egypt story, highlighting the relationships here and the integration of these stories. So let's put our keywords back up, and we'll jump in starting here in verse 26 with the brothers eating lunch and the caravan of Ishmaelites on their way. So as Sharon Pace Jameson, I said her name backwards there again, I'm sorry, says, in light of the disposition of Joseph into the pit, quote, Judah's pleas for Joseph's life are a transparent deception for distraction from his true motive, personal gain. So she's seeing that Judah is about profiting and raising the question of profit here. But the word for profit, mabetza here, means illicit gain. It's only here in Genesis. And in the two places I noted here in Exodus 18:21 and Judges 5:19, it's translated that way. Let's look really quickly here. We see here it's translated as dishonest gain, and that's enough to get the idea. So is he saying that he's pleading for what dishonest gain is it? He certainly can't be immediately expecting to be saying what we're doing is dishonest, but certainly some sense of the benefit. As Pearson notes, with the root of the word meaning to cut off, suggesting that profit is not what is in mind. So what else would it be if it's not profit? Well, it's ambiguous like so much else here, but he's after the question of some benefit for them that they don't get if they kill our brother, and conceal his blood. And the level of ironies here just run really deep, because in a way, they'll do the exact opposite. They'll reveal his blood that's not his. It'll be goat blood, as we'll see. And so rather than concealing the blood, they make a point of revealing it, but with falsity. We've seen the word for conceal earlier, and note the elements in which it's connected with. So earlier it was the mountains by the water and the flood, Noah's nakedness by his sons, Yahweh's intention from Abraham in the question of Sodom, and Rebekah's face from Isaac when she comes down off the camel. So various concealings there, and notice that 2 of them involve clothes, and this doesn't involve clothes right now, but it will involve clothes in the event, as we'll see. And we'll see that also connects us with chapter 38, which is all about Tamar's concealing her identity via clothes. So given that rhetorical question that they don't answer, he offers a proposal. And as White notes below, Judah's proposal thus arises from the vulnerability of the brothers to the possibility of immediate and certain profit, as Jacob's offer to Esau was a response to his vulnerability for Red Sioux. So the question of the parallels there, since Jacob called on his brother Esau to sell him his birthright in exchange for the bowl of lentils. Well, these brothers have already eaten, so there's no question of their immediate hunger there, although perhaps that's meant to be another ironic remembrance of that. So let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. And this is the first time we're hearing sell here. It'll come up a couple of more times, introducing the money theme, as we'll see, and recalling Jacob and Esau, and also Leah and Rachel regarding their father Laban, as we can see here in 31:15. Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he's been using up the money given for us. And so literally, of course, Laban did not sell his daughters, but that's how they're perceiving it. And notice the link between selling and foreigners, and here Ishmaelites as foreigners, but also as relatives. I was noting, of course, the Ishmaelites are more obviously relatives, because any reader would certainly know that Ishmael was the older brother of Isaac. But the Midianites are also relatives, because Midian is one of the sons of Abraham's second wife, Keturah, as we heard back in Genesis 36:35. So there's both of them are family in an interesting way. So he proposes, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. Again, we don't know how they perceive that's who they are, but he says it out loud here. And not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother. And this is incredibly poignant, because later, as you can see in the examples I gave here, if we were looking in small print, I can show a couple of examples of it here. He calls him Yeled, boy, the boy. And we see that here in those 6 times in these passages here. So here he is our brother. It's the last time they acknowledge that. Not only that, our own flesh, Basar, that we saw back in the Garden of Eden, and then we saw here with Laban and Jacob there, since you're part of my flesh. And so given that he's their brother in flesh, they still agree to sell him. And yet the word for agree is not agree. It's shema, like they heard it. And it's not necessarily implying agreement at all. And we note other places where the word heard is used, and it certainly doesn't imply agreement. Like we saw back here in verse 21, when Reuben heard it, which is to say, to go back a couple verses, they plan to kill him. He offers an alternative. So the fact that we hear down here in verse 27 that they heard it does not at all mean that they agree. They may still want to be killing him. And so let's scroll down to see the rest of our scene for now. And so we get to verse 28. There's all kinds of controversy. You can see in my note below a chiasm, but we'll look at that next time. That's the part I was looking at that frames here with the Midianite traders, and you can see that right here. But let's look at it in detail here before we get to that. So Midianites we see in Numbers, and I already noted that. As Wenham notes, despite numerous critical attempts to deal with Ishmaelite Midianite here, which is to say, as I showed last time, the Westermann older view is to attribute it to 2 sources. He says, quote, these proposals all rest on unanalyzed assumptions of the critics, and choosing one assumption rather than another is quite arbitrary. Rather, it seems better to take both as alternative designations of the same groups of traders. And what Wenham's tapping into there is that all the way back to the ancient Jewish Midrash are questions about Midianites versus Ishmaelites. Fackelman tries to solve it by suggesting that Ishmaelites is the vague term, such as Arabs, or we might say Indians or Native Americans, and Midianites is a specific group. But it's exactly one of the assumptions that Wenham is criticizing for having no real basis in that one is a major group and one is a minor group. We would know that if it was Canaanites and other groups, because Canaanites certainly implies all the peoples of the land, and then we have specific tribal or ethnic names. But we don't have that with Midianite. But the other question is, who sold him? Because later Joseph will say, my brothers sold me, but is he right? Let's look more closely at the verse, and more recent scholarship, I think, lays it out pretty clearly that the brothers did not. So let's keep in mind where they are. They're sitting down to eat, and Judah is talking to them, but they're not by the pit. And that's what we find out here, because it says Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, and then returned to his brothers. So the brothers are not at the pit where the traders passed by. So what we see is the Midianite traders here, using the same word that we saw for the people that Abraham negotiated with, the Hittites, back in chapter 23, passed by, which is to say they Hebrewed, using avir, the word for passing by that makes them Hebrews, crossers or passers-by. They, and that's the ambiguity that we see down there. And so my note down below is underscoring the points that I just made. If they is the brothers, there's no point introducing the Midianites. In other words, we could just go from, let's sell him, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites. Or they drew up Joseph. But what do the Midianite traders have to do with it if the brothers drew him up? So what we hear is the Midianite traders passed by while the brothers were away from the pit. They drew Joseph up out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites. Notice again the doubling here, that they drew him up and lifting him out. We don't need to hear both of those, and that's not exactly a doubling. It's not the same words, but the same kind of pattern we've been seeing. So what we can see, I think, more clearly is the Midianites passed by, they pull him up, and they decide to sell him to the Ishmaelites. Midianites, in other words, must be another group who came by along with the caravan of Ishmaelites. And that wouldn't be that surprising, that people on a major trade route would find companionship or security and safety with others along the way in case something went wrong or in case of attack. We don't have a lot of evidence of that in the Bible, but it certainly would not be surprising. So they sell him for 20 pieces of silver. And Wenham notes the typical price according to Leviticus for male slaves aged 5 and 20 years old, but we don't know Leviticus from within the story. And yet silver is going to be key. And you can see down my note below, kesef, the word for silver. We've seen it a number of times earlier, especially in the scene of negotiating for the burial place. But now it's 25 times after this, and silver will be the keys. So as Joseph is sold by the Midianites, so the question of silver and Benjamin and the others will come back, as we'll see later. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So now he's gone. And so now we get a surprising thing. When Reuben returned to the pit, well, where was he? If we scroll back up to see where we saw Reuben last time, he said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness. And yet when we go back down to verse 29 down here, it seems that he'd somehow gone away from the pit. So Reuben's movements are unclear multiple times here. And notice he said to return twice. He returned to the pit and he returned to his brothers. But his hope, said unconsciously through the voice of the narrator in verse 22, is that if he rescued Jacob, he could return their brother to their father. But that's what he can't do here because of what's happened, because Joseph is now on the way to Egypt. So when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, and it's literally like was not, as we'll see, he tore his clothes, which makes the chiasm with Jacob tearing his clothes down there, and then returned to his brothers, indicating the point that I made earlier. White notes below, Reuben, who earlier heroically challenged his brothers, is now reduced to pathetic silence. The solidarity of the group is regained and the concealment of the crime is made certain. And that's, of course, exactly what will happen. But then his cry is poignant and will echo what we'll see in Jacob's cry in a few verses. We'll see it next time, in the poignancy of how the sound play expresses a level of incoherence, but also a level of mourning. So now he's gone from being the brother to the boy, the Yeled, which we'll see later, and literally is not. The boy is not, and where can I turn? But notice the Hebrew below has a play word sound in it that's almost completely symmetrical. Va'ani, ana, ani, va. And the sounds there will echo, as we'll see, differently into Joseph's plea when they bring the robe with the goat blood on it and ask him to identify it or not. And so Reuben is now in despair. We don't know how Judah's feeling about it. And Joseph is on his way to Egypt when they decide what they're going to do to try to convince their father that his beloved Joseph is dead. See you next time for that. Bye-bye.